So right here, I have a shadow box with me, and within it, we have a pumpkin. So we set the still life up this way because it's good to start with a single light source to avoid the influence of the ambient light from the environment as much as possible. I'm going to start by blocking in a primary shape of the pumpkin. Next, I'm going to go into a little bit of straight line construction. So pumpkin is very much a spherical shape. That's why we use it as an example. So you can basically look at it as more of a irregular sphere with a lot of these subforms kind of sticking out on the primary form, and also has a lot of these indents and ridges. And for this one, you can be fairly simplified. And so at the lay-in stage, you really don't have to put in a lot of details. It's mostly to create a template for the value that you're going to be putting down later on. So you can see right now I just have these bigger subform. I also want to section out the different planes on the stem. So we have a top plane, which is a spherical shape. Stem also has this front-facing plane. You can see it's somewhat like a ribbon shape where that kind of wider front plane would come in and then turn away from the weaver. And so there's a little bit of a twist happening. All right, so now we have a basic contour of the pumpkin, and we also want to kind of put in a ground plane. So for this assignment, we will try to simplify the environment a little bit, even though there are lots of folds going on. And so that also includes cast shadow. So we will simplify the cast shadow a little bit, try to generalize it more into a elliptical shape, even though it does kind of turn when it hits this corner of the shadow box. So we can maybe put in a little bit of that fold, but overall try to keep it pretty simple. Next, we're moving on to the overall form shadow of the pumpkin. So obviously, if you're looking at it as it is, it has this sort of peaks and indents as it travels down the form because the pumpkin has a lot of subforms. But in the beginning, it's good to find a generalized shape for the form shadow. And so this is a lot of times that can be the core shadow of an object. So you can look at where that overall shadow shape ends. So obviously there's going to be a lot of parts of the form shadow that would break. From there, we can start to section the form shadow into these individual forms, and throughout the process also find a little more of these subforms that are on the pumpkin. So now I have the like a general lay-in of the shape. So I'm gonna go in with a 2B charcoal and wanna accent some of these areas where the edge quality gets a little sharper. Usually this is where all the cast shadows are. And now that I've established the differences in edge quality, I want to do a very general block-in of my shadow mask. And I'm just using a 2B charcoal and using mostly just the sides of my pencil to lay in a flat value. So I'm not really putting in any value shifts at this stage. I just want this to be a very flat shadow mask, only one value. And again, when we're doing the hatching, try to use your arm, do this kind of fast sweeping motion, and make your hatching consistent. Especially for the background tone, I want to make the hatching really flat and really try to avoid any kind of distracting texture. And to further flatten out my 2-value block in, I'm going to just take a piece of my paper towel and go over my shadow mask. So you can see right now I have kind of like a posterized version of my reference. And this is my two-tone value statement. And then I can start build other values upon it. But it's really important. It's a very important stage. So don't skip it if you're doing a tonal drawing. So now, before I get started working on my shadow mask, I'm going to mark the brightest point on the pumpkin. So I'm going to lay in some of these highlights, and don't have to go crazy when you're just marking it down. So this is just for me to know not to exceed this value in my highlights, because it's quite easy to do that sometimes when you're working with white charcoal, because it is kind of fun and you do want to, you'll feel like that you want to put it everywhere. So I'll definitely refrain from doing that. And even though I'm seeing brighter values in other area, I'm going to make sure that this is the brightest highlight and nothing is going to exceed that. Generally, your black and white charcoal should remain separated. And obviously, when you're rendering some of these transitional values, they can maybe cross over a little bit, but it shouldn't be done intentionally, right? It's, you know, if it ends up kind of overlapping with each other, it's completely okay. Just make sure not to mix them on purpose. So you can see how I'm approaching rendering this darker pitch shadow, really feathering the tone that I'm putting down. I'm not making it very dark and crisp, that line. I'm building it up gradually, and I'm just doing, I'm darkening the value path by path. And this should be the general approach that you take when you're drawing tonally, is to refrain from going too dark too fast. But definitely try to build up your values layer by layer if you can. Our eyes tend to exaggerate certain areas while flatten other areas, like the shadow mask. So if we want to create the experience of, say, looking at an actual object instead of looking at a photograph, so if you're using photo references, is extremely important, is to apply this rule to your reference photo and instead of copying every detail that you see, try to omit some of them. And you'll actually be surprised how much of a difference that it makes. Because a lot of time, great art is not about how much that you put in, it's actually about how much that you leave out. So at this stage, we're still kind of working into the shadow. So I want to gradually, we can come back to that, and I want to gradually bring in some highlights. So I'm going to start from my highlight, that's the brightest point of my image. And now I'm going to be a little more specific just with the shape of the highlight that I'm seeing. I can see maybe a little bit over here. gradually kind of crossing over and getting closer to the shadow. So this area, comparing the two, even though that area can look very high contrast, but it's a little further away from our light source that's kind of coming from here. But it probably looks a little more high contrast because of the effect of simultaneous contrast, wherein your perception of value would change according to the values that are next to it. And for tone paper drawing, it's especially important when it comes to deciding the value of an area, say like the reflected light. Sometimes people end up making the reflected light too bright because it does look very bright next to something like the darker cast shadow or the pit shadow. But actually it really is not as bright as you think because it's still a part of a shadow mask, right? Because of the darker value next to it, you would perceive that to be brighter. So I'm gonna do like a generalized lay-in. And again, it's okay if the white charcoal cross into or overlap with some of the black charcoal. Just make sure that you're not mixing them together on purpose. And then adding a little bit of highlight near the stem, this kind of top plane that's facing the light source. Again, and anytime that I bring out some of these values, I want to make sure to restate my brightest highlight again. So a good rule to follow is that you want to go brighter in your light mask and you want to go darker in your shadow mask. You don't want to go into your shadow mask erasing some of the values unless you accidentally went too dark. And you're also don't want to start adding in too much black charcoal to your light mask, even though sometimes that can be necessary. So say for this ridge right here, there's still a little more contrast, so I'm gonna add in a little bit of a black charcoal, but usually you should reserve that for a stage like this where you have a lot of the other value lay in, and so you can assess it accurately. And lastly, you want to go back to accent some of these sharper edges, whether it's in the highlights or the shadows, again, to bring in a little more dimension. I think that's the thing with edge quality. So if you have all sharp edges, which is a thing that we tend to do because, again, it's sharpening edges. It's kind of a fun process to, bring some of these areas out, but definitely make sure to not overdo it. If you have all sharp edges, then nothing really looks sharp in comparison. And if you have all soft edges, same thing would happen, right? So it's about having a balance. And again, for some areas like, the back of a stem, since it's further away from us, I'll be very careful how much highlight that I put down to not compete with highlight in the front. And so when you have a sharp edge created from a cast shadow like this intersecting with a highlight, you have a double edge right here. So you'll have a sharp edge from the highlight and also sharp edge from the cast shadow. So this is where you really want to emphasize. And you basically have it at this stage. You can even keep, adding in more of these very subtle details. But the key for doing tonal drawing for a form that's a little more complex like this is to start still from general to specific. In this case, it's going from the two-tone value statement to a full value drawing. The other thing is to keep your light mask and the shadow mask separate. Refrain from putting in too much brighter value in your shadow mask and any sort of really dark value in your highlights, even though that area might look very high contrast because of simultaneous contrast. And lastly is to soften your shadow mask and really pull out some of these sharper edges and push the softer edges back. Then you have a sense of hierarchy, and then your object really look three-dimensional. So that's it for this section.
There is a lot of value in online art education. We have so much great instruction on NMA that is so easily accessible. Even when I was in school learning to draw and paint, nothing was online. Wherever you are in the world, you can get this instruction. And not only can you watch these lessons that are so valuable and so in-depth and so passionately instructed, but you can watch them again and again and again.